Hello and welcome back to another video of the Brainy Heart. In this video, we'll be talking about strokes. In the last video, I touched upon the topic of strokes, but I wanted to make a separate video for strokes because it is a pretty important topic that you guys should know. Be sure to check out my previous video where I talked about the circle of Willis and what would happen if there's a stroke in the particular arteries. So be sure to check out my previous video, which I'll link below in the description and up top. Anyways, let's get back into the video. So I'll be talking about 5 different types of strokes and how they can be very dangerous. I'll also be talking about how each different stroke forms and how it happens. So let's get right into it. The first stroke that I want to talk about is the hemorrhagic stroke. And hemorrhagic stroke is when one of the arteries in the brain bursts, causing bleeding. So this over here is a regular artery with blood flowing, and let's just say all these arteries are leading to the brain. So a hemorrhagic stroke is when this artery bursts open and there's blood spilling all over. And this will reduce the amount of blood that's being sent to the brain. And remember, these arteries are leading up to the brain. Just to point out, this is just a rough sketch of how an artery would look like. This is not any real artery inside the brain, but it could be. But this is just a rough sketch to show what the hemorrhagic stroke does. So when the hemorrhage happens, which is when the burst happens, the artery basically bursts like a balloon, and blood starts bleeding out of the artery and spilling out. And this, like I said, reduces the amount of blood that's sent to the brain itself. So, if you have high blood pressure, you're most likely to get a hemorrhagic stroke, because the artery will burst because there's a lot of pressure in there, and it's just like a pipe that has a lot of water with a high pressure in it. It's probably gonna burst because of the pressure. It's the same thing over here. The artery cannot withstand too much pressure, so it's gonna burst. But it can happen for other reasons as well. There are not a lot of treatment options for a hemorrhagic stroke other than opening up the skull and doing a surgery to stop the bleeding. But that can be really dangerous because we're dealing with the brain here. So one wrong move can be very tragic. And a CT scan or MRI scan is used to diagnose this stroke. You might experience weakness on only one side of the body, or you might feel a decreased level of consciousness, difficulty speaking, fainting, headaches, seizures, and sensitivity to light. So that's one of the strokes, and it's not as popular as the next two that I'm going to be talking about. The next type of stroke that I want to talk about is the ischemic stroke. There are 2 different types of ischemic strokes. The first type is the thrombotic stroke, and it is when a thrombin forms in an artery that's leading to the brain. Now, if you're wondering what a thrombin is, it's basically when the platelets block the artery. How this happens is that homeostasis is triggered at the wrong time. Homeostasis happens when you fall down and you're injured, and there's a lot of bleeding. So when you fall down and you're injured, and you have bleeding, that means your artery has a hole in it, basically. So when the platelets come by, they block this hole so that there's no more bleeding, and then the blood nearby also thickens to reduce the bleeding. So that is basically homeostasis. But when a thrombin forms, homeostasis is triggered at the wrong time. So platelets basically start clumping up together, and they start blocking the artery. So there's very, very little blood flow in the artery. And there's less blood being sent to the brain. And eventually your brain cells will die out and your brain will basically give up. But that was basically a thrombin. If a thrombin forms in a different artery that's not leading to the brain, then it's called thrombosis. But if it forms in an artery that's leading to the brain, it's called a thrombotic stroke. The second type of ischemic strokes is the embolic stroke. A embolic stroke is when a thrombin, a small thrombin, forms in some other artery of the body. Normally it's in the heart. So let's say it forms in the aorta. Let's say this thrombin forms in the aorta. Then, since it's small, it's gonna travel with the blood and it's gonna get stuck in a smaller artery. So when this happens, it's basically when this happens, there's basically less blood flow to the brain. And it's basically a thrombotic stroke that's on the move. So to diagnose this or any other stroke, you have to get a CT or an MRI scan. Your doctor cannot just look at your head and say if it's a hemorrhage or a ischemic stroke. Now, there is some diagnosis, there is a treatment for ischemic strokes, but this has to be done within 4 hours of the stroke or else it won't work. This treatment is called TPA. TPA stands for Tissue Plasmogen Activator. Tissue Plasmogen Activator. What this basically does is that it is a protein, so it has a lot of enzymes. And when this is injected by a professional doctor, it travels to the area that's blocked, and with the enzymes that it has, it basically breaks down the blood clot. And therefore, it restores blood flow to the brain. Remember, this has to be injected within 4 hours of a ischemic stroke. The next type of stroke that I want to talk about is the TIA, Transient Ischemic Attack. This is also called the mini stroke. It is when platelets block the flow of blood to the brain for a short amount of period, and then they unblock it, basically. There could be a block over here, but then that could be there for about, let's say, 10 minutes. This is just a estimation. It could stay there for as long as it wants, but soon it will move away and it'll just unblock it. So there is blood flow. So you may feel dizzy for some time, or some of your functions might shut down. Because remember, each artery supplies different parts of the brain. So if this happens in an artery that's supplying your occipital lobe, you might lose your vision for just some time, because the occipital lobe is not getting blood to operate. And if this happens to the frontal lobe, you might lose your decision-making skills or something like that. And if there's a full-blown stroke, then it's going to shut down the whole thing. So if there's a full-blown stroke in an artery that's leading to the occipital lobe, then your vision's going to get very, very blurry, or you might even go blind. Coming back to transient ischemic strokes, this does not cause any permanent damage, but if you're getting a lot of mini strokes, then you're most likely to get a full-blown stroke that can be very, very dangerous and life-threatening. So if you ever feel very dizzy and lightheaded, be sure to go to your doctor and get it checked and get some treatment before it becomes a full-blown stroke, and it could be tragic. The final type of stroke that I want to talk about is the brainstem stroke. It is when a thrombin forms in the brainstem. Now, the brainstem basically connects the brain to the spinal cord. So, if you do not know what the spinal cord does, it basically takes in information from the brain, and the spinal cord sends it to other parts of the body, like your hand or your legs. So your brain might want the legs to do something, so the brain sends a message to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord sends a message to the... So if there's a block in the brainstem, then there's no exchange of information between the brain and spinal cord. If this ever happens, you'll probably feel your blood pressure shoot up, your respiration will decrease, and you'll slowly become unconscious. And this is because your spinal cord needs information from the brain to make the body work. If not, your body's going to shut down on you. More severe brainstem strokes can cause the locked-in syndrome. The locked-in syndrome is when the patient is only able to move their eyes, and this is because the other parts of the body are not receiving any information to do anything, so they basically just shut down. And this can be very dangerous and very bad for you. So, like I said before, you have to get a CT scan or an MRI scan to diagnose this stroke. So that was the final type of stroke that I wanted to talk about. Those were the 5 main different types of strokes. There are a bit more, but they're pretty minor, and they won't occur a lot. These 5 can be very dangerous, so if you ever feel any symptoms of a stroke, then be sure to go to your doctor or physician and get it checked before it can be very life-threatening. Remember, stroke is when something happens in an artery leading to the brain. It's not a stroke if it happens in an artery leading to the legs. That was it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned from it. I'm always open to comments, questions, and or suggestions. Check out my blogging website at brainyhearts.wordpress.com. I will also link my blog about strokes in the description below, so be sure to check that out as well. This is the Brainy Heart signing off. I'll catch you later in the next video.